Often when playing Destiny, a lot of people ask me, what are the best Warlock stats for PvP? With how much cooldowns have changed, my answer has definitely changed over time, and in today's video, I'm going to answer that question. I'll break down the ideal and minimal stats you should be running in for all your stats on Warlock as of Season 21, as well as a hierarchy of importance for each stat. So if you're tired of digging through a bunch of build videos to figure this out, then this video has got you covered. I'll also leave timestamps below so you can jump around throughout the video if there's a particular stat you're more interested in. Now let's get into the video, and don't forget to drop a like if you found it helpful. Starting with our first stat, and that first stat is going to be mobility. And in my opinion, not to spoil anything for later, but this is the least important stat for Warlock because this stat impacts a lot of things that don't really benefit Warlocks as a whole. The important thing to note about mobility is a lot of people think mobility increases sprint speed. I even used to think that at one point. It does not increase sprint speed. It actually only increases walking, crouch walking, and strafe speed. Again, not very beneficial for a lot of things we're going to be using. And ultimately, if you wanted the actual benefit, which would be increased sprint speed, we'd have exotic for that, like transversive steps. In terms of what I recommend for mobility, I'm running tier 1, as you can see here, and that would be, in my opinion, for me and what I find noticeable, optimal. If you wanted to go a little bit higher, I have little d2armorpicker.com here, which is pretty awesome because it actually shows you how much each stat increases. We're gonna be using this a lot throughout the video, but the max I would go to is up to tier 4, because the max you would go to tier 4 gets you to a plus 16 increase to your walking speed, strafe speed, and crouch speed, which is not bad, but I wouldn't want to go much higher because that's going to start sacrificing other stats that are much more important down below. And so that's why I'd recommend not going any higher than tier 4. This is the most I used to actually run back in the day, but I actually really never noticed that much of a difference. The only argument I could see for this is strafe speed for peak shotting, so strafing in and out of cover a little bit quicker. That I could see being a benefit. As you can see, you are a whopping 0.68 meters slower at 0 and 1, or 0.33. So again, just not overall a very beneficial stat. Next, we have resilience, which ties a little bit into our survivability. And how it does that is the more resilience you have, the higher health you have overall. So as we can see here, as you up your resilience, you can see hit points, or essentially what your overall health is, goes up. And as you get to the higher end of things at tier 10 or 100 resilience, you get to 200 health. Now, where I recommend to land optimally is around 6. The reason I recommend 6 is because this does a couple of things. One, it gives you just enough health to where for precision shotguns, which are currently the most popular, it requires 11 pellets, I believe, instead of 10. And so that's going to make you a little bit harder to kill, give you a better chance to come out of those shotgun duels where you kind of slide into each other, a little bit higher chance of surviving some of those fights. Or if you're getting away, again, having that little bit of extra health just puts you right above or across the threshold where you can survive a lot of things. This also, I believe, impacts Thorn perk, so super helpful there as well. Now, if you really don't want to invest in this at all, or you just don't find resilience super valuable, that's when then you could go as low as, or the minimum would be, tier 3. Tier 3 is the minimum one I go to, just because that's going to let you survive some things. You're still going to be super vulnerable, but there's just huge drop off in terms of how much damage you can take just by going down below 3. So 3 is the minimum I'd recommend, but optimally I would go tier 6 is what I would recommend for Warlock. Jumping in next to our recovery, and this, in my opinion, is the most critical stat on Warlock, and I could argue for any class period, but especially on Warlock, because as we know in a first-person shooter, staying alive and not dying is pretty critical. And so the thing about recovery that, again, a lot of people think or get misconstrued is that they think it speeds up how quickly it starts your health regen. And from what I understand, the health regen is actually the same regardless of the level of recovery that you're running. But what it does increase is the speed, or how fast your health regens once you've lost health. And so that's critical because, as you're going to see here, I'm going to use our trusty D2 armor picker, and you're going to be able to see at tier 10 or 100 recovery, your regeneration time is 6 seconds with a rift cooldown, because our recovery on Warlock ties into our rift cooldown is 41 seconds. And so if we go down to tier 2 or 20 recovery, you can see our regeneration time, it takes an additional 2.5 seconds roughly to get our health back to full. And as you can see here, 122% or additional 50 seconds added to our rift cooldown. Obviously, no one should be running anything running this low of recovery, but especially in PvP, because it's going to delay before we can do a fight, obviously how much we can utilize our rift to stay alive or take control of a map. And so what I recommend here that I think is optimal, you guessed it, would be 100 or tier 10 recovery, because of that low regeneration time and that low rift cooldown, because rifts are just so powerful and they tie into so many other abilities and activate different mod perks that help other cooldowns. And so just a lot of synergy starts with our rift on Warlock. And so you're gonna want that regen time as low as possible. Now, if I were to do what's minimal, what I would minimally recommend, I would go as low as tier 8. Low as tier 8, because you can see we go from a 6-second regeneration to a 7, which isn't terrible. So it's only an additional second, which isn't too bad, and only adds 10 seconds to our rift regen. But after you go down to tier 8, you can see it just starts getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So I wouldn't go any below. So minimal, if you're really strapped for stats and you don't want to invest too much in recovery, the minimal I'd recommend is tier 8. Optimal be tier 100. But this is probably the most important stat on Warlock. Next, we have discipline, and this was going to control the cooldown of our grenades. And so what I recommend here, especially in the current meta we're in, abilities are very dominant. So the more you can get your abilities, the more you can spam your abilities, chances are the better off you're going to be, and the better you're going to be able to prime your targets for a fight, meaning the more damage you're going to have taken from one of your abilities, and it's going to be easier to gun them down with one of your weapons. And so talking about what stats I recommend here, optimal, and as you can see what I'm running, I recommend tier 8, and the lowest or the minimal being tier 6, because as you can see, that's only going to give you a roughly increase your cooldown by roughly 24%, depending on the grenade that you choose. But as you can see, going up from tier 6 is going to give us a roughly as high as 20, or I guess we don't have a flux grenade, so as high as 18-second reduction in our cooldown, depending on the grenade. And so because the grenades are so powerful, and on top of that, we have mods that can further reduce this cooldown, I wouldn't recommend going any higher than tier 8. And with the way that mods work currently, you could go as low as tier 6 and then use mods to compensate for these lack of 2 tiers. But I typically recommend going tier 8, and then with mods can go push this even farther to what would more or less be the equivalent to having 100 discipline, just because of how impactful having your grenade ability can be, especially on Warlock where you have so many powerful grenade options. Tier 8 is what I would recommend. Next, we're talking about Intellect, and this stat used to be a lot more important than it is now, especially when supers were just incredibly powerful and the duration of the super was super long. A lot of that has since changed, so that's why this is not maybe as important as it used to be, but definitely in certain modes like competitive or trials can be very impactful and can really start that snowball effect of chaining supers and creating orbs for your teammates to allow you to win multiple rounds in a row, or shut down another enemy who's popping their super early as well. And so not as important as it used to be, but not to be underestimated either. In terms of what I recommend, in terms of what I would, in terms of minimal, this is going to be probably the most subjective, arguably, of all the stats, because it really depends on how good your super is or not. So for example, Arc Warlock comes to mind for me on this one, and I would think minimally you could run tier 4 on Storm Trance or Chaos Reach, and you're still going to have around 8-minute and 48 super, and so that's not too bad, and that's not counting any kills or anything, that's just at base. And I recommend that specifically when I talk about Arc, because the supers on Arc aren't that good, or aren't really the strongest point of that subclass, and you can put that into your melee or strength, I should say, for lightning surge and things like that. And so that's like a very fringe example. But if you're running something that had a little bit more of a dominant super, a roaming super, anything like that, I think what would be optimal would be tier 7. Because as you can see, we're shaving off at as high as 1 minute and 20 seconds, depending on this tier of super, which is pretty substantial. Obviously, you gain additional 20 seconds here, but I just don't see tier 8 being quite as impactful. You really see diminishing returns after getting to tier 7. So optimal for Intellect on Warlock is going to be tier 7, and then minimal 40 if you're really not investing in it, or if you're running Arc Warlock, so you can invest more in some of your other abilities like your discipline and your strength. And last but certainly not least, we have strength. And This one has the lowest ramp up or littlest differences between the tiers. And again, somewhat similar to Intellect. And again, this just depends on the subclass you're running. I don't recommend going too hard on Strength. And again, unless you're running Arc Warlock, which I feel like is just like the fringe example for a lot of these stats because of things like Lightning Surge and the potency that has and the uptime you can get. But overall, I would say what is optimal for Strength is going to be tier 6. I don't actually have tier 6. Don't judge me. But tier 6 is what's going to be optimal because as you can see, when we get to tier 6, that brings us to around the 1 minute-ish mark for a lot of our cooldowns, which is typically where I like to be. I feel like having your ability cooldowns around the 1 minute mark, if possible, is a pretty good balance. But something that's interesting is if you go from like tier 3 to tier 4, there's a huge drop off between tier 4 and tier 3, which is why I wouldn't recommend going any lower than tier 4 for Strength. And then it's pretty minimal. I mean, tier 4 to tier 6, you get a reduction of 26% on your cooldown, so as high as 24 seconds. And so that's why I recommend tier 6 as being optimal, and absolutely minimal is tier 4, because as you can see, a lot of our abilities getting around that minute and a half mark, which is kind of on the longer side for our strength cooldowns. But again, similar to Discipline, strength can be compensated with armor mods, which we're not really getting into today, to help reduce those strength cooldowns. So if that's something you want to do, you want to put this maybe at tier 4, that's the lowest I would go even with those mods, so you can actually see more of a benefit. But if you can, in conjunction with all the stats we've already talked about, get around tier 6, even tier 5, and here in this range is going to be the sweet spot. Now that we've covered all the stats, I want to quickly run through the hierarchy of importance. And this can vary, and you can switch stuff up in terms of the order depending on the subclasses we've kind of talked about. But first is going to be recovery because of the increase of survivability. Discipline next because of the impact it has on things like Titan shields and rifts and blocking off points, and just overall utility grenades have in Destiny 2. Next is Intellect to kind of support with the snowball effect of helping us dominate a match or multiple rounds, especially in 3v3 game modes. After that, at number 4, we have Resilience because again, kind of ties into survivability a little bit and is going to make us a little bit harder to kill and hopefully give us the edge in some of those fights. After Resilience, at number 5 is Strength. This is going to be super helpful depending on certain abilities. So again, Lightning Surge comes to mind here. So again, this could move up depending on the subclass, but it's probably the least impactful and requires the least investment to get the best bang for your buck. And last, but certainly not least, is Mobility, because why? And who cares about the strafe speed or any of those things when you could just use transversive steps instead. But again, if strafe speed for whatever reason is super important to you, go ahead and go crazy with Mobility, and this can move up higher on the list of importance for you.